It's January 18, 2019. This is the RheumNow podcast brought to you by RheumNow.live, the next best meeting in rheumatology. Rooms like us go to meetings like this. Today we have a lot of information about two big hearings from the FDA on two big drugs, all within the last week. And there's more. At the top of the news, we have an interesting study about contraceptive use in patients with rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis. It's a survey, it's actually three surveys of a total of 164 patients, 138 of them being rheumatoids. And it finds that roughly the same amount of patients are using contraception with both psoriasis and rheumatoid arthritis, women of childbearing potential. It finds that 1/3 are using what's called highly effective contraception. About 30% are using effective methods, but there is a difference on ineffective methods, and you have to read the article to get the full picture here. But RA patients are more likely to be involved in ineffective contraceptive use, whereas psoriatic arthritis, not so much, 35 versus 11%. No contraception was pretty uncommon in RA, but pretty common in PSA, 1.5% in RA, 23% in PSA. The point being that contraceptive use in our patients, our young female, childbearing potential, rheumatoids and psoriatics, is number one, often not discussed. Number two, most rheumatologists don't know enough to really guide patients. And number three, what you need to know is the ACR is coming out with big-time guidelines on contraceptive use. Should see it in the first quarter of 2019, led by Lisa Samaritano at the Hospital for Special Surgery. There's a big committee on reproductive issues, contraception, lactation, pregnancy, drug use. I was on the committee. A lot of work went into this. It's going to be 3 different manuscripts, chock full of dense amounts of information. It's going to take a while to digest, but it's going to really be helpful to bring rheumatologists up to snuff when it comes to guiding your patients about contraceptive use. So there's this tweet that I saw out there about the number of patients with polymyalgia rheumatica, biopsy-proven polymyalgia rheumatica, but who have a normal sed rate and CRP. Turns out that the diagnosis was actually made and really best proven by FDG-PET. So Hector Chinoy tweeted an article that appeared in Rheumatology, in the journal Rheumatology, 460 PMR patients. This is not GCA, this is PMR. And they had an FDG-proven diagnosis of inflammatory disease, although they had normal CRPs and sed rates. That's a rate of about 1.2%. So while I thought this was incredibly interesting, the question is it practical? If you really believe someone has PMR, are you going to do an FDG-PET to prove it? And who's going to pay for it? No one and no one. On the other hand, it does say it is possible to actually have a diagnosis of PMR and still have normal acute phase reactants. Remember that that's the exception and not the rule, and I think you have to go pretty far to prove the point. So is this clinically useful? No. Is it a fascinoma? Yes. An interesting registry study looks at patients with lupus and lupus nephritis who went on to develop end-stage renal disease from 1995 to 2014, showing that the mortality rate in this population of lupus nephritis with renal disease actually declined significantly, almost was cut in half from 11.1 to 6.7 events per 100 patient years. Mortality was dropped for both whites and African Americans, but also for Hispanics, all dropping anywhere from 32 to 49%. And they also declined for cardiovascular death and death from infection, declining by 44 and 63% respectively. The point, I guess, here is that lupus patients with nephritis who are a bad lot, meaning they have renal disease, they are high risk for death, high risk for other comorbidities, and yet you, the rheumatologist, is doing a pretty good job of managing them and reducing their mortality rates. Kudos to you, and kudos to all the researchers who have guided us in achieving this sort of benchmark. The Dan Bio and Artis are two big registries of rheumatoid arthritis patients in Europe, and they've been very instrumental in studying safety issues. And their recent study compares the risk of serious infections between those patients treated with either abatacept, rituximab, or tocilizumab. Now, I don't know if you have a strong feeling one way or another about which of these is the safest or if there's an advantage. Well, I think I would have predicted no difference, and the rates would have been fairly low. The actual rates varied from 4.7 to 8.1 SIE, serious infectious events, per 100 patient years, meaning 100 patients followed a year, 5 to 8 of them might be hospitalized with a serious infection. It was not statistically or clinically meaningful, the differences between those three biologics, suggesting that, again, it's the rate of SIEs is fairly low and usually predicted by the severity of the disease and not necessarily the biologic being used. If you're following the influenza story, you should be. You should be vaccinating your patients. The CDC report from early January suggests that there are 7 million cases of influenza in the United States currently, that it's estimated that there's somewhere around 70 to 84,000 patients who are hospitalized for flu-related illness. We know that this is going to translate into a significant number of deaths over time. H1N1 is the most common strain nationwide, but there are other strains. The current vaccine is directed at H1N1. The other strain is not covered by the current vaccine. But if you look at this CDC MMWR report, and we have the link on the website, you'll see that 30 states are hotbeds and have a rising rate of influenza. So the FDA had two big panel meetings. One was on Wednesday, wherein the FDA panel reviewed the cardiovascular safety of romosozumab, the anti-sclerostin drug being touted for women with postmenopausal osteoporosis. There was another one that we'll talk about next, which actually has to do with febuxostat. But first, the romosozumab, which is so much fun to say. And, this is a sclerostin drug. The data has looked really, really strong. The ability to prevent vertebral fractures is very strong, better than bisphosphonates. And the ability to protect against non-vertebral fractures looks good, although not always significant. The real issue here is that in one of their studies published earlier this year, there was a cardiovascular event rate. And that led to a complete response letter from the FDA to Amgen, the sponsor. The drug's been developed in cooperation between Amgen and UCB. And so they had to regroup and come back to the FDA with more data, and now the hearing to look at the safety data of this drug. The drug, romosozumab, its trade name is Evenity. And again, the application is for use in women with osteoporosis, postmenopausal osteoporosis. So they did present very strong efficacy data. Both the FDA and the sponsor had good data about its efficacy and otherwise a good safety profile. They did also show that there was a slight risk, and while the vote was strongly in favor of the drug being approved by the advisory panel, 16-1, many of the panelists suggest concerns about the cardiovascular safety, asking for long-term post-marketing studies to further prove it. I think that this is probably a fair outcome. My only gripe with this is the panel. The FDA advisory panel is the Bone, Reproductive, and Urologic Drugs was the advisory committee reviewing this osteoporosis drug. There were a few bone experts. There was one rheumatologist. There was two or three obstetrician gynecologists. There was 3 or 4 urologists. I don't get the makeup of this committee as far as making a decision about this biologic designed to affect sclerostin and osteoporotic outcomes. But nonetheless, that's the way the FDA runs it, and why they kind of group drugs. I mean, the arthritis drug is grouped with pulmonary drugs. Does that make sense? Not always. So look to see what the FDA does. Sometimes it takes up to 6 months for the FDA to make its decision, and usually they back the panel's recommendation. But I was on the panel for the Vioxx hearings, and we recommended put Vioxx back on the market and keep all the COX-2s FDA paid no attention to was Vioxx stayed off the market, Bextra was removed, and then there was a big brouhaha about Celebrex and keeping it on the market, and ultimately that led to the Precision study, which we talked about recently. The other panel discussion took place on the 11th, last Friday. Febuxostat was in front of the FDA panel for its cardiovascular risk, and it's something that's been out there for quite some time. Febuxostat was approved in 2009, but not at the first go-round. It actually had failed at the FDA twice because of concerns about cardiovascular safety, and had received complete response letters. But that led to the FDA mandating a much larger study called the CONFIRM study. Take at-risk individuals, give them either allopurinol or febuxostat, and see what happens. And whereas the earlier studies, the 2 or 3 earlier studies, showed that there was a higher rate of cardiovascular death and endpoints with febuxostat, the CONFIRM study showed that was not higher. In fact, it trended a little higher for allopurinol or otherwise equal. That led to the drug being approved. Well, there was a post-marketing commitment in that study, and that was called the cardiovascular, it was called the CARE study. The CARE study was a much larger study and designed to enroll people who were at risk and to see what would happen if they got febuxostat or allopurinol. So this panel included the Arthritis Advisory Committee, of which I was an invited member, and the Drug Safety and Risk Management Advisory Committee also met. A total of 22 individuals voting, included rheumatologists, cardiologists, internists, epidemiologists, statisticians, pharmacologists, patient representatives, and a non-voting industry representative. In the end, there was a vote. Could we keep the drug on? Should we keep the drug on the market? Should we remove it? Should we do something else? 19 people voted in favor of keeping it on the market. 2 were against it, a cardiologist and a statistician, and there was 1 abstention from an internist, sort of epidemiologist kind of guy. And most people felt that the drug, while it has some sort of small risk here that's very worrisome, it does have a role as another urate-lowering therapy that can be used after allopurinol, especially in those with allopurinol hypersensitivity, maybe those with renal failure, extreme renal failure. We know we can use allopurinol in the face of renal insufficiency and just monitor it, but some patients can't take it, and therefore this may be a good option. So remains to be seen what the FDA will do with this. In the United States in 2017, there were 3 million prescriptions for allopurinol. There was 200,000 prescriptions for febuxostat. There's 15 million patient years of febuxostat exposure, so the safety parameters or profile of this drug has been fairly well established. And we'll look forward to seeing what happens. Again, the problem with the study was that as far as its primary endpoint was the number of MACE events, that's major adverse cardiovascular events, was supposed to be less than 1.3, a hazard rate of 1.3 or less to be equivalent to allopurinol, and in fact it was exactly that number. So the primary endpoint was met. There was no higher rate, so therefore there's no worry. But the other things that were studied under the MACE definition, cardiovascular death, non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke, unstable angina, there was a higher rate of cardiovascular death in patients who were treated with febuxostat compared to allopurinol, and that was significantly higher. So the other problem was that there was a lot of dropouts. Only 55% of patients completed the trial, 45% did not complete. There was incomplete data. Many people pointed out that a lack of full data tend to favor the null hypothesis and make the drug look good. And so finding the cardiovascular death was maybe a glaring red flag. So again, we'll see what the FDA does with this data, but we voted to keep it on, and we asked for things like labeling changes, black box warnings, or a REMS program to further establish the long-term safety of this drug. An interesting study came out on anakinra and acute crystal-induced arthritis. This was published in the Journal of Rheumatology. 100 patients, 115 acute crystal events. Most of these were gout patients who were treated with anakinra, either 1 shot or 2 shots or 4 days of shots, but it was variably used. But nonetheless, when you consider all these patients, so this is a retrospective study, there was 73% of patients had partial or complete response within 4 days. More than half the patients had a complete response or partial response within 1 day, suggesting that anakinra may be a useful tool in the management of acute crystal-induced arthritis, especially in the inpatient setting. These patients were inpatients. They were very sick. They had all kinds of problems, from transplant to renal failure to infections. It was sort of a very difficult cohort to study, and there was no control here. So this is sort of a real-world study. You got to worry a little bit about that. But nonetheless, it was, I think, instructive. We'd like to see some studies done in this area. Our last report has to do with predictive factors for scleroderma renal crisis. And we know that, cold weather, steroid use, dehydration, rapid progression of skin, tendon friction rubs, RNA polymerase III antibodies, and pregnancy are historical risk factors for the development of scleroderma renal crisis. This is a single-center study here from Walter Reed National Military Center that studied their systemic sclerosis cohort over a 10-year period, and specifically looked at 31 new cases of renal crises that developed amongst a larger set. And they found that at baseline, the factors that were predictive of future renal crisis included proteinuria, anemia, hypertension, chronic kidney disease, an elevated sed rate, thrombocytopenia, hypothyroidism, anti-Ro antibodies, and anti-RNA polymerase III antibodies. Again, the odds ratios here range from being a few fold higher to being 20, 14, 138-fold higher, 183-fold higher for proteinuria. The point, I guess, here is that maybe if you have a systemic sclerosis patients, you should look at these. Any one of these factors actually was not all that predictive, but turns out that at 3 of these nine factors actually had a sensitivity of 77%, a specificity of 97% in predicting future crises. So it's not a bad profile to measure your patients against. So that's it for RheumNow. Make sure you check out RheumNow Live. The website is rheumnow.live. And tune in next week. You can go to the website and find these citations and more. We'll see you next week on the RheumNow podcast.